Welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our guest author is Father Romanus Cessario, OP. The book is The Grace to be a Priest, published by Clooney Media, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com. Welcome, Father.
Great pleasure to be here, Mr. Keck.
It's great to have you here. The Grace to be a Priest. Talk about a timely book with everything that's been going on in the church, obviously. There's a lot of discussions related to the church itself, to the priesthood itself. What made you decide to write this book?
I made the decision to write the book in order to help priests primarily discover the uniqueness of their God-given vocation. And I did that well before some of the present controversies that have come into the media were made known. So this represents a classical instruction about the Catholic priesthood that is consonant with the apostolic tradition, the fathers of the church, the scholastics, and the Catholic theology.
Right, and it began as part of an ordination retreat that you gave back in May of 2014?
That is correct. The actual selection of topics were written for young Dominicans who were ordained in Washington some years ago. And at that time, I chose the issues which I felt had been neglected by some contemporary accounts of the Catholic priesthood.
Now, you say that while events from the life of St. Dominic illustrate the contents of this book, its composition enlarges on the general principles of Catholic theology. How did you use St. Dominic in the book?
Well, obviously, when I spoke to the Dominicans, I illustrated my points by reference to the life of St. Dominic. And then the thought came to me, I've been teaching diocesan priests for 25 years, nearly, this is my 24th, in Boston. I'm very happy to have done so. And I said, I have to do something to help the diocesan priests. The Dominicans can take care of themselves, and they are taking care of themselves pretty well, I'm happy to announce. And therefore, I made the point, I excised all of the specific references to Dominican priesthood, which means the same priesthood lived in the context of a consecrated life. And I made the text useful for all priests, whatever order they belong to, but especially for diocesan parish priests. And I also kept in mind lay people who might want to discover the mystery of the priesthood, which they may have developed some bad notions about as a result of the secular media.
Okay. In the section on the predestined soul, you say, each man who becomes a priest does so because he has received, as far as one may judge, a special grace from God. No man, properly speaking, approaches priestly ordination solely on account of his personal initiative.
That's correct. That is correct.
Is that your case? Is that what you found with your own calling?
Well, it's not a question of my own case. This is a universal rule. The only person that might be stand out from that universal rule would be a man who presented himself with malice or fraud. And I think that's going to be a null set, or it's going to be a very small set, because it's very difficult to discover reasons why a celibate priesthood would be of advantage to a man to seek it for other reasons. It'd be difficult to discover them. Please note, I'm not talking here about personal motives that can be various and shaped by different factors.
I see. Okay.
We're not talking about motives. Some, people say, well, he chose the vocation because his family pressured him. He chose the vocation because he wanted. That's not what I'm talking about.
Or in some parts of the world, somebody would say, well, he can get a good education.
Exactly.
Or it's a way to
exactly.
move ahead.
Right. Well, that's not what I'm talking about. Some of those could be legitimate, by the way, within an overriding context of the divine premotion. The phrase, Mr. Keck, comes from St. Louis de Montfort. He says to those who have devotion to Our Blessed Lady, "O predestined soul." So this predestination, this predestined soul, is not limited to priests. This is, in fact, the commitment God gives to baptism. And as you know, within the Christian communion, there are vocations of service to the communion, and there's the vocation of marriage. And in both cases, people are moved to fulfill those vocations by God's design. And anyone who, now speaking for the consecrated and specific vocations of service to the church, marriage is a little more complex because it's also a natural reality.
Right.
But, however, the consecrated vocation and the priesthood, if they're not graces, then what are they?
Right. Okay. So for yourself, you became a religious versus a diocesan priest, but you make the point, obviously, in this book that you kind of target this for the diocesan priests as well.
Yes, I had them in mind because I think...
What is different in the sense of somebody who feels they're called to the priesthood and they're discerning diocesan versus religious?
Well, you know, a religious priest takes on an additional form of life that is specified ultimately by the charism of the founder, as the Second Vatican Council said, but more proximately by, for the most part, constitutions, a rule, the rule of St. Benedict, the rule of St. Augustine, or equivalent documents that govern a religious institute. The diocesan priest does not take that on. The most obvious example would be the diocesan priest's promise of evangelical simplicity and the religious promise of poverty, which can also be construed in different ways. However, the fact is, the diocesan priest rightfully possesses his own financial substance, shall we say, and he has a responsibility to care for it in a way that is consonant with evangelical simplicity.
You said that every Catholic priest commits himself to the wood of Christ's manger bed and the wood of his cross.
Well, now we're into the question of what are the spiritual counsels that are proper for all priests to receive. And these observations are reflected throughout the whole of Christian history. That the priest is identified with Bethlehem is because of his poverty or evangelical simplicity, because of his humility. No priest should flaunt his sacerdotal state or clerical character. The word clericalism is used sometimes, even the Holy Father. Fine, it's an excessive application of the dignity of the priesthood. So Bethlehem, the priest has to be close to Christ with Mary. There are certainly societies and priests who would consider themselves to be close to St. Joseph as a father, as someone who watched over the Christ child. So there's, out of the association with the manger, with Bethlehem, we could exhaust this interview about things that are proper to the priest, but also, remember, the same thing can be said about other vocations in the church, married and consecrated. No Christian can say, oh, that nativity stuff, I don't want anything to do with that. That has nothing meaning for me.
Okay.
As far as the cross, it's more specific to the priest. Every Christian is with Christ on the cross. With the priest, it's more specific because he transubstantiates. And the transubstantiation, as we know, is a reenactment of Christ's sacrifice on the cross. This is the most sacred moment. The Mass that I've had the pleasure of saying here at your chapel with Father Mark very aptly showed, and I noticed with the people at Mass, a great devotion to the moment of the consecration. We've lost this in many places. It needs to be restored. And the priest has to understand what his identity as a sacrificer is, because he is. It's in the Catechism. He sacrifices.
Well, you made the point. You say some priests consider themselves high-end religious social workers. And you also brought up something I hadn't really heard about in a long time. I remember the worker priest movement. Why did you bring that up?
Well, the worker priest movement is an historical event, shall we say. It involved French Dominicans before the council in the 1950s. In a word, in an effort, by good-willed men, to recapture the working class in France. So you know that there are many theories about why the practice of religion in France declined after the Second World War. And one of them, but whatever the theories are, the fact is that the working class was practically lost to the church. This is, you can see it today in all the little villages where there are empty churches, fine. So the worker priest said, well, we will do this by going to the working class where they work, thus worker priests. And that included factory work and assembly line work. And the worker priest donned the same overalls, stood next to the fellow workers, and then eventually, when they started complaining about this or that or saying this or that, they began to say, well, let's look at it this way. Oh, I'm a priest. And they thought, okay. Well, it was a good-willed idea, however, and it met with some temporary approval by the church, and then it was discovered that this was, of course, blurring the lines completely between the sacred nature of the priesthood and a secular occupation. And it was disbanded, and it was so I find some Dominicans were in fact punished because they had tarried too long with the idea.
Okay. Now you
Now let me just say one other thing, if I may, quickly,
Sure.
because it's an important feature of the book. I identify 3 misconceptions about the priesthood that infect the contemporary thought among Catholics. One, that he is a religious social worker. It's the most common one. Secondly, that he's the poor man's counselor. And third, that he's the plant manager, which is a step down, or the human resource manager. And these are grave misconceptions about who the priest is. The priest is somebody. He doesn't do things. He's not defined by what he does. He's defined by what he is. This is why the church talks about character. This is why the church says there is no ex-priest.
Right, the indelible mark that carries him. Okay. Now you quote Walker Percy here.
Do I? Yeah.
In 1983, still fits our present-day circumstances. If Christ brings us new life, it is all the more remarkable that the church, the bearer of the good news, should be among the most dispirited institutions of the age. Is it, and why is that?
Well, that's Walker Percy's evaluation of the church of the post-conciliar period. I think I'm not an expert on Walker Percy, and in fact I will, in full disclosure, say that that text was given to me, in fact, by a bishop who is something of an expert on the literature of that period, including Flannery O'Connor. And I thought it was important to put it there to recognize that the post-conciliar period has not turned out as well as the fathers of the Second Vatican Council may have hoped. I think it's impossible to deny that.
Right. Some think that the supernatural grace to be a priest arises from vocational discernment, but you say too much discernment, however, can prove counterproductive to the fostering of a priestly vocation.
Yeah, well, this is, of course, my Dominican response to another very common current that places an overemphasis on discernment. That the priestly, a man who comes to a seminary has to exercise rational consciousness in order to know that this is the vocation to which God is calling him and to which he should give himself. That goes without saying. So when I speak about grace moving, I don't mean that it moves an inert instrument. It does not. God moves according to the capacities of the person, knowledge and love. However, if you interpret discernment to be an introspective, subjective act carried on in isolation from everything going on around you, possibly even from God, but this is highly counterproductive to the fostering of priestly vocations and the sustaining of priestly life and mission. And the reason is because it forces the priest to an untoward introspection, which, as you may know, if you don't, I'll tell you sadly, in many of them continues to their discernment to leave the priesthood.
I see, okay.
Notes are put up. I've discerned that another vocation. Well, the bishops finally caught on to this. The better ones are saying, look, you can use discernment up until I put my hands on your head.
Right.
After that, there's no more discernment. A senior prelate, a cardinal I knew, the first thing he would say when the priest came in and said, "Oh, Eminence, I've discerned that I got to go and do something else," he'd simply respond, and he was a man of great stature, a man of great holiness. He would say, "But you are a priest. There's nothing to think about." Now, granted, footnote, always to distinguish, are some priests required to be put in special circumstances because of their bad behavior? Yes. But still, there are no ex-priests.
Right. And that's the point. You talked about the doctrine of the priest as a living instrument, and you were kind of alluding to that, and you said the priest comes among men not as a functionary, but as a consecrated head, shepherd, and bridegroom, because priests occupy themselves with sacred activities, teaching, governing, and sanctifying. They should move among men accordingly.
Right. Well, head, shepherd, bridegroom, teach, govern, sanctify, those are the theological categories that appear in the documents of the Second Vatican Council, Presbyterorum Ordinis and Optatum Totius. More recently, they appear in the post-synodal exhortation Pastoris Dabo Vobis of Pope St. John Paul II. Those are canonized categories, and they are categories that reflect Catholic doctrine, not theological opinion. They are the munera of the priest to teach authoritatively, to govern within the spiritual order, and to sanctify, of course. And these actions, and the reason why teach, govern, sanctify is associated with the images, fine, or metaphors, truth to be told, of head, shepherd, and bridegroom. Well, first of all, because of the biblical language, but it's to make the point that the priest is a different kind of person. He's not a guy who has some jobs or tasks that we can do better.
Right. Exactly. In order to grasp adequately the fatherhood of the priest, one should eschew common misconceptions. First of all, though the reservation of priestly ordination of males complements the fatherhood of the priest, spiritual paternity does not result from an a priori option to commit unjust prejudice against women. Why did you want to make that point?
Well, because the question of what constitutes discrimination is one that requires a great deal of explanation in our contemporary circumstances. And the Church, of course, solves the problem simply by saying she is opposed to all unjust, or we could say in English, unfair discrimination. But many people do not accept that qualification, and they label unjust or unfair discrimination according to the secular standards. Well, if discrimination is going to be governed by the feminist movement, that's not going to work for Catholic theology.
Right.
The feminist movement, Pope St. John Paul II did all he could to rescue from it the authentic elements of that movement, mulieris dignitatem. And he did a wonderful job of it, by the way. And good Christian women, good Catholic women, rejoice in that. I'm a good friend because I'm in Boston, Professor Marianne Glendon, and she's a spokesperson for that fine. So is there a Christian feminism? Yes. Did Pope St. John Paul II explain it fulsomely? Yes, he did. Okay.
Right.
Those women don't think they're being unfairly prejudiced by not being priests.
Right. You talk about certain proposals in the Church homogenizing visions of priestly life, and you say that those proposals for renewal that blur the distinction between the priest and the non-ordained also undermine evangelization. How so?
Well, because, all right, that's a strong claim, I recognize. Well, it undermines evangelization because it doesn't conform to the structure, the hierarchical structure of the Church. There are reasons. I mean, I would address your audience to a book that received very little attention, Justice in the Church, by the late Father Benedict Ashley. It's still available. It was published by CUA Press. Those were lectures he gave in Washington. They were called the McGivney Lectures, sponsored by the Knights of Columbus. That book is a treasure trove of arguments that explain why the exclusion or the reservation of priestly ordination to males is not unfair prejudice.
Okay.
It's some of the reasons need serious attention, however, because in our present cultural climax, it would be very easy for people prima facie to take them to be. I want to mention in this, it's very brief, an historical anecdote that was just pointed out to me by a distinguished woman, professor of patristics, doctor of sacred theology. And we were talking about this very point, Mr. Keck, and she said to me, you know, Father, have you read Hildegard of Bingen? I said, well, no, really, I haven't read a great deal of her, but I know about her. I know that the esteemed Pope Benedict XVI held her in German. And much like our Catherine of Siena, Hildegard of Bingen went after unchaste clergymen of her time. And she went after them with perhaps more precision than we hear in some of the secular press. At the same time, namely, as she was doing that, she wrote a treatise on why women should not be priests. Okay. And that text could be looked at. It would require, again, exegesis, because her categories are the 12th century, I think, and so that becomes complicated. But let's take Catherine of Siena, you know, who went to the Pope, not about sexual things, but something more serious, the fact that the Holy See had been displaced to France, you know. And, you know, we know how she dealt with him, never proposing that she take his place.
Right.
We know how she dealt with unchaste priests. There are letters to unchaste priests. There are letters to priests struggling with chastity. Everyone should read those letters. Her collected letters are available. They're very touching, and if you want to show the right attitude toward someone who discovers an unchaste priest, leaving aside the question of criminal priests, I don't want to bring that, but unchaste priests, first of all, read Catherine of Siena.
Right. Now, in the section 4, one who sacrifices, talking about the Eucharist, you said, in each of the other sacraments, priests communicate to a fit recipient the goods of divine grace. In other words, in each of the other sacraments, the priest shows pastoral charity to others. In the Eucharist, however, the priest not only administers the sacrament, he also becomes the recipient of it.
Yeah, you can't have a valid Mass unless the priest who consecrated the host consumes the host he consecrated and drinks the wine he consecrates. In other words, the body of Christ consecrated at that Mass, transubstantiated at that Mass, and the blood of Christ transubstantiated at that Mass. And when the priest does that, he himself becomes a participant in the grace of the Eucharist, and in truth to be told, a unique way.
What is a hermeneutic of rupture? We've heard some of that in the last few years.
Well, Pope Benedict XVI, God preserve him, in the famous Christmas allocution, pointed out that after the Second Vatican Council, too many theologians adopted, hermeneutic is a fancy word for overriding premise. Fine. They adopted an overriding premise that everything had to be looked at with suspicion, and the suspicion could lead, and in many cases did, to a rupture with the past. And Benedict pointed out that the Church had lived on the principle of continuity since the New Testament. And anyone, and there are, the earliest heresies were judged so because they were judged not to be consonant with the teaching of the apostles. Marcionism, we're going to cut out the Old Testament because it doesn't belong to us. It's one of the okay.
We hear that even now today in some Protestant sects talk about that, where they're not very happy with the Old Testament. So.
Okay, well, that's your expertise. I'm not. Right. Fine. So, but there are many other areas, of course, about rupture, and Pope Benedict was concerned, and he rightly so, moreover. And he stressed that you cannot have an overriding premise, a supposition, that we're going to look at this and we're going to discover something bad and we're going to break with that bad tradition when you're talking about things like the 7 sacraments, when you're talking about persons such as the Blessed Virgin Mary, when you're talking about the hierarchical structure of the Church. in short, when you're talking about what's in the Catechism of the Catholic Church.
Right. You make a point, you say that middle-aged priests perhaps feel loneliness, or this loneliness, more than young priests do. What loneliness and why does that happen?
Well, I'm not a middle-aged priest anymore. I want to preface my answer to that. Well, some of the students, I mean, I've been teaching seminarians for 38 years. So I have a few that are middle-aged. And I've observed that after a while, what the young priest discovers to be exciting, suddenly you're calling him father. He maybe not so much today, but there was a time when he would be invited into homes. He would be celebrated. We're so happy you're here, Father. You know, and the children need a young man to give, and so on and so forth.
Right.
This sort of that wears off after a while. I mean, there are bad experiences with parishioners. There are other things that happen. And it's easy for the middle-aged priest to feel isolated.
Mm-hmm.
He may discover, you know, the bishop that ordained him was a great guy. He felt very supported. The bishop that came in after him didn't like him so much because of his liturgical practices. That's not uncommon. And he feels isolated, yeah.
Okay. The book, The Grace to be a Priest, Father Romanus Cessario, OP. Thank you very much,
Father. A great pleasure being with you.
Spend the time with you. Interesting book, published by Cluny Media, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com. Priests, we need them. If you have a vocation, think about it. I'm Doug Keck. Join us next time, right here on Bookmark.